In my 43 years as a prison psychiatrist, I've sat across from serial killers, mass murderers, and some of the most twisted minds our society has ever produced. I've listened to confessions that would make your blood run cold, analyzed behavior patterns that defy human comprehension, and witnessed the darkest corners of the human psyche. But there's one case that haunts me more than any other, not because of what I learned, but because of what I never learned. My name is Dr. Margaret Chen, and for 2 decades, I served as the chief psychiatrist at the Federal Correctional Institution in Oxford, Wisconsin. During that time, I evaluated hundreds of inmates, conducted thousands of psychological assessments, and compiled detailed profiles on America's most dangerous criminals. But it was a series of sessions I conducted in 1995 with an inmate named James William Lewis that opened my eyes to one of the most terrifying unsolved cases in American history, the Tylenol murders of 1982. What happened in Chicago's suburbs that autumn didn't just kill 7 innocent people. It changed how we think about safety, trust, and the vulnerability of our most basic human needs. It was domestic terrorism at its most insidious, delivered not through bombs or bullets, but through something as innocent as pain relief medication. And after 13 years of analyzing the mind behind these crimes, I believe I understand not just what happened, but why, and why it's never been solved. This is the story of how cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules terrorized an entire metropolitan area, how a killer turned America's medicine cabinets into potential death traps, and how the investigation into these murders revealed a criminal mind so calculating, so methodical, that even today, 4 decades later, we're still trying to understand the psychology behind one of the most chilling cases in FBI history. 7 people died in the span of 3 days. 7 families were destroyed. An entire nation lost its innocence. And somewhere out there, a killer walked free, having committed what many consider the perfect crime. But after years of psychological analysis, I don't believe it was perfect at all. I believe it was personal. September 29th, 1982, began like any other Wednesday morning in Elk Grove Village, Illinois. The Chicago suburbs were entering that beautiful phase of early autumn where the leaves were just beginning to turn and families were settling into the rhythm of a new school year. In the Janus household on South Arlington Heights Road, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman was getting ready for another day of 7th grade. What happened next would forever change how Americans think about the safety of over-the-counter medications. Mary woke up that morning complaining of a sore throat and runny nose, typical symptoms for a young girl adjusting to the cooler weather and the stress of a new school year. Her parents, Dennis and Gina Kellerman, did what millions of American parents do every day. They reached for the family medicine cabinet. The Kellermans were a typical suburban family. Dennis worked as an engineer, Gina was a homemaker, and they lived in a well-maintained ranch house in one of Chicago's safest communities. They were the kind of people who followed instructions, who trusted in the safety of products they bought at their local pharmacy, who never questioned whether something as innocuous as a pain reliever could become an instrument of murder. At approximately 7 a.m., Gina Kellerman gave her daughter a single extra-strength Tylenol capsule. The bottle had been purchased recently from a local pharmacy, sealed and apparently untampered with. Within minutes of taking the medication, Mary began experiencing severe symptoms. She collapsed in the family bathroom, and despite desperate attempts to save her, she was pronounced dead at Northwest Community Hospital just hours later. The medical examiner who performed Mary's autopsy was Dr. Edmund Donahue, and what he discovered sent shockwaves through the Cook County medical community. Mary Kellerman had died from acute cyanide poisoning. The concentration of cyanide in her system was massive, over 600 times the lethal dose. But how had a 12-year-old girl in suburban Chicago been exposed to such a lethal amount of one of the world's most deadly poisons? The answer lay in something that sat innocuously in medicine cabinets across America, a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. When investigators examined the remaining capsules from the Kellerman family's bottle, they made a discovery that would terrorize the entire Chicago metropolitan area. Someone had carefully opened individual capsules, removed the acetaminophen powder, and replaced it with pure potassium cyanide. The capsules had been resealed so expertly that there was no visible sign of tampering. But Mary Kellerman was just the beginning. Before I continue with this disturbing case, I need to pause and ask you something. If you're watching this video, you're clearly someone who's fascinated by the psychology behind true crime cases, someone who wants to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. That's exactly why I created this channel, to give you insights that you won't find anywhere else, perspectives from someone who's actually sat across from these kinds of criminals. If you want to make sure you never miss these deep psychological analyses of America's most baffling cases, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, what I'm about to reveal about the Tylenol killer's psychological profile will challenge everything you think you know about this case. And if you're already feeling that chill down your spine, wondering how someone could be so calculating, so methodical, you're going to want to hear every detail of what comes next. Later that same day, September 29th, in nearby Arlington Heights, another family was about to face the same unimaginable tragedy. Adam Janus was a 27-year-old postal worker who had recently returned home from the hospital where he'd undergone minor back surgery. Like Mary Kellerman, Adam was experiencing discomfort and reached for what he believed was safe, effective relief. Adam took 2 extra-strength Tylenol capsules at approximately 3:30 p.m. His wife, Teresa, found him collapsed on their bathroom floor less than an hour later. Paramedics rushed him to Northwest Community Hospital, the same hospital where Mary Kellerman had been pronounced dead just hours earlier, but it was too late. Adam Janus died at 7:15 p.m., and the initial cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. But the true horror was yet to come. The Janus family gathered at Adam's house that evening to grieve and make funeral arrangements. Stanley Janus, Adam's 25-year-old brother, and Stanley's 19-year-old wife, Teresa, both complained of headaches brought on by the stress and grief of losing Adam. Seeing the bottle of Tylenol sitting on the kitchen counter, the same bottle Adam had used earlier, they each took capsules from it. Within hours, both Stanley Janus and Teresa Janus were dead. 3 members of the same family, killed by the same contaminated bottle of Tylenol within the span of a single day. From a psychological perspective, what's particularly chilling about these murders is the killer's understanding of human behavior. They knew that when one family member found relief in a particular medication, others would likely use the same bottle. They understood the ripple effect of tragedy, how grief and stress would drive the surviving family members to seek the same relief that appeared to be safe for Adam. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated exploitation of predictable human responses to pain and loss. By the morning of September 30th, the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office was beginning to see a pattern that defied medical explanation. 3 healthy individuals from the same family had died within hours of each other, all showing signs of cyanide poisoning. But it was what happened next that truly revealed the scope of this attack on public safety. Mary Lynn Reiner was a 27-year-old mother who had recently given birth to her 4th child. On the morning of September 30th, she was at home in Winfield, Illinois, suffering from what appeared to be postpartum complications. Following her doctor's advice to manage her pain with over-the-counter medication, she took 2 extra-strength Tylenol capsules. Like those before her, Mary Lynn Reiner collapsed within minutes and was dead before medical help could arrive.
The psychological profile I developed during my sessions with James Lewis, who was investigated extensively in connection with these murders, revealed something crucial about the killer's methodology. This wasn't someone acting in a fit of rage or passion. This was someone who understood the pharmaceutical supply chain, who had studied the distribution patterns of over-the-counter medications, and who had planned these attacks with the precision of a military operation. Later that same day, Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant for United Airlines, stopped at a Walgreens pharmacy on North Wells Street in Chicago's Old Town neighborhood. She was preparing for another flight and purchased a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol to manage a headache. Paula took the capsules at her apartment around 10 p.m. Her colleagues found her body the next morning when she failed to report for her scheduled flight. The killer had now struck in multiple jurisdictions, at different types of retail locations, targeting different demographics. This wasn't about personal revenge against specific individuals. This was about creating maximum terror and confusion. The psychological assessment I conducted suggested someone with intimate knowledge of how panic spreads through communities, someone who understood that the fear of random death would be far more powerful than any targeted attack. By October 1st, 1982, the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, the Chicago Police Department, the FBI, and multiple suburban police departments were working around the clock to understand what was happening in their communities. The breakthrough came when investigators realized that all of the victims had taken extra-strength Tylenol shortly before their deaths. Dr. Thomas Kim, a toxicologist working with the medical examiner's office, made the connection that would crack the case wide open. When he examined the stomach contents and blood samples from all 5 victims, he found massive concentrations of potassium cyanide. But more importantly, when investigators began examining unopened bottles of Tylenol from the same lot numbers and manufacturing dates as those used by the victims, they discovered that the contamination was not happening at the manufacturing level. This was product tampering on a scale never before seen in American criminal history. Someone was purchasing bottles of extra-strength Tylenol from retail locations, carefully opening the capsules, replacing the contents with cyanide, and returning the bottles to store shelves. The level of planning and execution required for such an operation suggested a criminal mind of extraordinary sophistication and patience. The psychological profile that emerged from my analysis of this case revealed several key characteristics of the perpetrator. First, this was someone with access to pure potassium cyanide, not an easy substance to obtain without raising suspicions. Second, they had the technical knowledge to open and reseal gelatin capsules without leaving obvious signs of tampering. Third, they understood retail pharmacy operations well enough to know how to return contaminated products to store shelves without detection. But perhaps most importantly, this was someone who understood the psychology of fear. They knew that by spreading the contaminated bottles across multiple jurisdictions and different types of retail locations, they would create a sense of random, inescapable danger. No one would know which bottle might be contaminated, which store might be compromised, or which family might be next. The investigation that followed was one of the largest in FBI history up to that point. Special Agent Roy Lane Jr., who led the federal task force, described it as the most complex case of domestic terrorism we had ever encountered. Over 100 FBI agents were assigned to the case, along with investigators from the Illinois State Police and multiple local police departments. The scope of the investigation was staggering. Agents interviewed over 35,000 people, followed up on more than 6,000 tips, and examined hundreds of bottles of Tylenol from stores across the Chicago metropolitan area. They discovered that the contaminated bottles had been placed on shelf at Walgreens, Jewel Osco, and other major pharmacy chains throughout the suburbs. What made this case even more complex from a psychological standpoint was the almost immediate emergence of copycat crimes. Within days of the Chicago area murders, similar product tampering incidents began occurring across the United States. In some cases, these were hoaxes designed to extract money from pharmaceutical companies. In others, they were genuine attempts to replicate the Chicago killings. The copycat phenomenon revealed something crucial about the original killer's psychological makeup. They had created a new category of crime, one that could be easily replicated by individuals with far less sophistication and planning ability. This suggested someone who not just understood the immediate impact of their actions, but the long-term psychological and social consequences as well. During my sessions with James Lewis, who became a person of interest in the case after sending an extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million to stop the killing, I gained insights into the type of personality capable of conceiving and executing such a plan. Lewis himself was never charged with the actual murders, but his psychological profile matched many of the characteristics I believed the real killer would possess. The individual responsible for the Tylenol murders displayed what we call organized criminal behavior. This is someone who plans their crimes meticulously, takes steps to avoid detection, and often inserts themselves into the investigation in some way. They're typically highly intelligent, socially competent, and able to maintain normal relationships and employment while carrying out their criminal activities. But there was something else that made this case unique from a psychological perspective. The killer chose a method that was both highly impersonal and deeply intimate.
On one hand, they never directly confronted their victims. The murders were carried out through a product that could sit on a shelf for days or weeks before being consumed. On the other hand, they were inserting themselves into the most personal aspects of their victims' lives, their medicine cabinets, their daily routines, their attempts to care for themselves and their families. This duality suggested someone with conflicted feelings about human connection and intimacy. They wanted to cause maximum harm while maintaining maximum distance from the consequences of their actions. It's a psychological profile that fits with certain types of antisocial personality disorder, but with an added component of what I came to call systemic sadism, the desire to damage not just individuals, but entire systems of trust and social order. I want to pause here for a moment because what I'm about to share with you goes beyond what most true crime content covers. We're not just talking about what happened, we're talking about the deep psychological motivations that drive someone to commit this type of systematic terrorism. This is exactly the kind of analysis you'll find throughout my channel. Insights from someone who's actually studied these criminal minds up close, who sat in rooms with individuals capable of this level of calculated violence. If you're finding this psychological perspective valuable, please take a moment to hit that like button. It helps me know that you want more of this type of in-depth analysis. And if you're interested in similar cases of product tampering and domestic terrorism, I've covered several other cases that show the evolution of this type of crime over the decades. You'll find links to those videos in the description below, including my analysis of the 2001 anthrax attacks and the psychological profile of the Unabomber. These cases are all connected by similar psychological patterns that reveal how certain criminal minds view society as their target rather than specific individuals. The immediate response to the Tylenol murders was unprecedented in American commercial history. Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer of Tylenol, made the decision to recall all extra-strength Tylenol capsules from store shelves nationwide, over 31 million bottles with a retail value of more than $100 million. This was a decision made not because they had any evidence that their manufacturing process was compromised, but because they recognized that public safety had to take precedence over profit. From a psychological standpoint, the killer had achieved something that no previous domestic terrorist had accomplished. They had forced a major corporation to essentially admit that they could not guarantee the safety of their own product. This was a profound psychological victory for someone whose apparent goal was to demonstrate the vulnerability of systems that Americans trusted implicitly.
The long-term impact of the Tylenol murders extended far beyond the pharmaceutical industry. The case led to the development of tamper-evident packaging that we now take for granted: sealed bottles, blister packs, safety seals, and multiple layers of protection that make products tampering much more difficult to accomplish undetected. But the psychological impact on American consumers was perhaps even more significant. The Tylenol murders marked the end of what sociologists call product innocence, the assumption that items purchased from reputable retailers were inherently safe. For the first time in American history, consumers had to consider the possibility that someone might have deliberately contaminated products on store shelves. The killer had successfully weaponized one of the most basic human needs, the desire for relief from pain. They had turned something as innocuous as taking a headache medication into a potentially lethal act. The psychological terror this created extended far beyond the Chicago suburbs, where the actual murders occurred. Over the years, several individuals emerged as suspects in the Tylenol murders, but none were ever charged with the actual killings. The most prominent was James William Lewis, whom I had the opportunity to evaluate extensively during his incarceration for the extortion attempt. Lewis was a fascinating case study in criminal psychology. He was highly intelligent, with an IQ measured at over 130, articulate, and capable of maintaining what appeared to be normal social relationships.
But beneath this surface competence was a deep-seated resentment toward authority and social institutions, combined with what I diagnosed as narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features. During our sessions, Lewis displayed several characteristics that aligned with my profile of the Tylenol killer. He had an extensive knowledge of chemistry and pharmacology, having worked in various technical capacities throughout his career. He understood corporate structures and decision-making processes well enough to craft an extortion demand that specifically targeted Johnson & Johnson's vulnerabilities. Most importantly, Lewis demonstrated what I call proxy aggression, the ability to cause harm through indirect means, while maintaining psychological distance from the consequences. He seemed almost proud of his ability to manipulate systems and people without getting his hands dirty, so to speak. But Lewis always maintained his innocence regarding the actual murders, and despite extensive investigation, law enforcement was never able to develop sufficient evidence to charge him with the killings. This left open the possibility that the real killer was still at large, someone who had managed to commit what many consider the perfect crime. Another suspect who emerged years later was Roger Arnold, a former employee of a Chicago area company that had access to potassium cyanide. Arnold fit a different psychological profile, someone with grievances against specific individuals or institutions who might have used the Tylenol murders as a cover for more targeted revenge. Arnold's psychological evaluation revealed characteristics common in workplace violence perpetrators: feelings of persecution, a sense that he had been unfairly treated by employers, and a desire to get back at society in general. But like Lewis, there was never sufficient evidence to charge him with the killings. This left open the possibility that the real killer was still at large, someone who had managed to commit what many consider the perfect crime. The fact that this case remains unsolved after 40 decades suggests something profound about the killer's psychological makeup. This was someone who understood not just how to commit the crimes, but how to avoid the psychological mistakes that typically lead to arrest and conviction. They resisted the urge to claim credit, to insert themselves obviously into the investigation, or to escalate their activities in ways that would increase their risk of detection. Even today, the FBI maintains an active investigation into the Tylenol murders. In 2009, federal agents conducted searches related to the case, including examining the home of James Lewis and retesting physical evidence using modern forensic techniques that weren't available in 1982. The persistence of this investigation reflects not just the severity of the crimes, but the ongoing threat that this type of attack represents. The Tylenol murders demonstrated that a single individual with the right knowledge and psychological makeup could terrorize an entire metropolitan area, disrupt major industries, and fundamentally change how Americans think about product safety. From my perspective, as a prison psychiatrist who has studied this case for decades, I believe the killer possessed several specific psychological characteristics that made them uniquely dangerous. First, they had what I call systems thinking, the ability to understand complex social and economic systems well enough to identify points of maximum vulnerability. Second, they demonstrated extraordinary patience and self-control. The planning required for this type of attack, the precision needed to contaminate multiple bottles without detection, and the restraint required to avoid claiming credit or escalating the attacks all suggest someone with unusual psychological discipline. Third, they showed a sophisticated understanding of fear psychology. They knew that random, unpredictable violence would create more terror than targeted attacks. and they understood how media coverage would amplify their impact far beyond the immediate victims. But perhaps most disturbing from a psychological perspective is what this case reveals about the potential for invisible terrorism. The Tylenol killer was able to achieve maximum impact while remaining completely anonymous, faceless, and undetected. They proved that in a complex, interconnected society, a single individual with the right psychological makeup and technical knowledge could hold millions of people hostage to fear. It's crucial that in analyzing the psychology behind these crimes, we never lose sight of the real human cost. 7 people died because someone decided to use innocent consumers as pawns in whatever psychological game they were playing. Let me tell you about each of them, because understanding the victims is crucial to understanding the true nature of these crimes. Mary Kellerman was just 12 years old, a 7th grader who loved horses and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. She was the kind of child who rescued injured animals and spent her allowance on treats for neighborhood pets. Her death robbed the world of someone who might have dedicated her life to healing. Adam Janus was a young postal worker who had just married his high school sweetheart. He was known in his community as someone who would help elderly neighbors with their yard work and who volunteered at local charity events. His murder didn't just end his life, it set in motion the tragic sequence that would kill his brother and sister-in-law as well. Stanley Janus was 25 years old and worked as a paramedic. Think about the cruel irony of this. A man who dedicated his career to saving lives was killed by someone who had weaponized the very act of seeking relief from pain. Stanley had just been promoted and was planning to start a family with his wife, Teresa. Teresa Janus was 19 years old, barely out of high school with her whole life ahead of her. She had just started college and was working part-time to help pay for her education. Her death, along with her husband's, devastated both families and left their parents asking questions that would never be answered. Mary Lynn Reiner was a mother of 4 young children, including an infant she had just delivered. She was the primary caregiver for her family and was known in her community as someone who would babysit for neighbors and organize school fundraisers. Her death left 4 children without their mother and a husband struggling to understand how something as simple as taking pain medication could destroy his family. Paula Prince was a flight attendant who loved to travel and had seen the world through her work with United Airlines. She was saving money to buy her own home and was known for sending postcards to friends and family from every city she visited. She was independent, adventurous, and had a bright future ahead of her. The 7th victim was Mary McFarland, a 31-year-old who worked at a local store and was beloved by customers for her friendly demeanor and willingness to help anyone who came through her doors. She had taken the Tylenol to relieve symptoms of what she thought was a minor illness.
Each of these people had families, dreams, plans for the future. They had contributed to their communities, loved their families, and had every reason to expect that taking an over-the-counter medication would help them feel better. Not end their lives. The psychological cruelty of these murders lies not just in the deaths themselves, but in the complete randomness of the selection and the violation of one of our most basic assumptions about safety. Before I share my final analysis of this case, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever had a moment where you realized that something you'd always considered completely safe might not be? Maybe it was after 9/11, when flying suddenly felt different, or during the 2001 anthrax attacks, when opening your mail became an act that required consideration. The Tylenol murders created that moment for an entire generation of Americans. They forced us to realize that the systems we trust, the pharmaceutical companies, the retail stores,
the regulatory agencies, aren't infallible. That someone with enough intelligence and malicious intent can find ways to turn our most basic needs against us. I'm curious about your perspective on this. Do you think cases like this make us safer by forcing us to be more vigilant? Or do they make us more vulnerable by creating a climate of fear? Have you ever looked at a bottle of medication differently because of cases like this? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your insights often help me understand these cases from perspectives I might not have considered. And if you found this psychological analysis valuable, please share this video with others who are interested in true crime. This is exactly the kind of case that shows why understanding criminal psychology is so important for preventing future attacks. The more we understand about how these minds work, the better equipped we are to identify threats before they can cause harm. After decades of studying this case, both from the investigative files and through my psychological evaluations of suspects, I've reached some disturbing conclusions about the Tylenol killer and what their crimes represent. First, I believe this was not a one-time event committed by someone in a moment of crisis or rage. The level of planning, technical knowledge, and psychological sophistication suggests someone who had been building toward this type of attack for years. This was someone who studied systems, who understood human behavior, and who had developed a worldview that justified causing mass casualties in service of some perceived grievance or psychological need. Second, I don't believe the killer's motivation was primarily financial. While copycat crimes and subsequent extortion attempts focused on money, the original murder seemed to have been motivated by something deeper, a desire to demonstrate power, to create chaos, or to punish society for some perceived injustice. The killer could have made their extortion demands before the murders occurred, but they chose to kill first and leverage the fear afterward. Third, the sophistication of the attack suggests someone with connections to either the pharmaceutical industry, the chemical industry, or academic research. The knowledge required to obtain pure potassium cyanide, to open and reseal gelatin capsules without detection, and to understand the distribution patterns of over-the-counter medications points to someone with professional-level expertise. But perhaps most troubling is what this case reveals about the evolution of domestic terrorism. The Tylenol killer created a new template for how a single individual can terrorize large populations without using traditional weapons or making direct contact with victims. They proved that in a complex society dependent on trust and routine, even the most basic activities can be weaponized. The fact that this case remains unsolved for 42 years suggests that the killer possessed not just technical knowledge and psychological sophistication, but extraordinary self-discipline. They resisted every temptation that typically leads to the capture of serial offenders: the need for recognition, the desire to escalate, the urge to insert themselves into the investigation. This level of psychological control is extremely rare and makes them one of the most dangerous types of criminals we encounter in forensic psychology. The Tylenol murders changed America in ways that extend far beyond product packaging. They marked the beginning of what security experts call the vulnerability society, a culture where we must constantly consider threats that previous generations never imagined. Every time you look at the tamper-evident seals on a bottle of medication, every time you think twice about a product that seems to have been opened, you're living with the psychological legacy of what happened in Chicago suburbs in 1982. The killer achieved something that few criminals in American history have accomplished. They permanently changed how an entire society thinks about safety and trust. They created a new category of fear that continues to influence security policies, corporate practices, and individual behavior decades after their crimes were committed. 7 people died in those 3 terrible days in September and October of 1982. But in a larger sense, the Tylenol killer killed something else as well: the assumption that the systems we depend on for our daily survival are inherently trustworthy. They forced us to realize that safety is not a given, that trust must be constantly verified, and that the greatest threats sometimes come from the most unexpected sources. As I conclude my analysis of this case, I'm struck by how much it reveals about both the darkest aspects of human psychology and the resilience of human society. The killer may never be caught, may never be identified, may never be brought to justice, but the systems they attacked adapted, evolved, and became stronger. The pharmaceutical industry transformed its practices, law enforcement developed new investigative techniques, and consumers learned to protect themselves in ways they never had to before. The Tylenol murders represent one of the most psychologically complex cases in American criminal history, a perfect storm of technical knowledge, psychological sophistication, and malicious intent that created terror on a scale that few individual criminals have ever achieved. But they also represent something else. Proof that even the most calculating criminal mind cannot ultimately destroy the social trust and cooperation that hold our communities together. The investigation continues. The questions remain unanswered. But the 7 people who died in Chicago's suburbs in 1982 are remembered not just as victims, but as the reason we built better systems, developed stronger protections, and learned to be more vigilant about the safety we had once taken for granted. The Tylenol killer may have thought they committed the perfect crime, but perfect crimes don't change the world for the better, and that's exactly what happened in the wake of their terrible actions. Justice delayed is not justice denied, and somewhere out there, the truth is still waiting to be uncovered. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of America's most psychologically complex unsolved cases. If this analysis gave you new insights into the Tylenol murders or helped you understand the criminal psychology behind product tampering cases, please consider subscribing to my channel for more in-depth examinations of cases that shaped how we think about crime and security in America. And remember, if you have any information about the Tylenol murders, the FBI is still actively investigating this case. Sometimes the smallest detail, the overlooked connection, or the half-remembered conversation can be the key that finally brings justice to Mary, Adam, Stanley, Teresa, Mary Lynn, Paula, and Mary. Their families are still waiting for answers, and their memory deserves nothing less than the truth.